If Derek Chauvin were to appeal his convictions, what are some possible grounds he could try to appeal on, and what would that timeline look like? Welcome back to Legal Briefs. I'm Wes Austin. I'm a lawyer keeping you updated on the latest legal news. So Derek Chauvin last week was convicted on all 3 counts. So that's on second-degree manslaughter, third-degree murder, and second-degree murder. His sentencing hearing is going to be held on June 16th. And after that, he has 90 days to file a notice of appeal. So what are the grounds that Derek Chauvin could try to argue on appeal? That's what we're going to be looking at right now. We're not talking about how likely it is that any of these could succeed. Maybe at the end we'll talk about what I think about the likelihood of any of these issues prevailing. But right now we're more just issue spotting. Judge Cahill denied a motion for change of venue. I think that's one thing that they could try to appeal on, saying that, hey, this venue was the location all of the civil unrest, and we think that had an undue influence on the jury. Judge Cahill also denied the motion to sequester the jury, and I think this is another possible issue that Derek Chauvin could try to argue on appeal, is that the jury should have been sequestered. I also think they could try to argue that statements made in public had an undue influence on the jury and kind of intimidated the jury. For example, we had the $27 million settlement between the city and the family of George Floyd that was announced during jury selection. And that was terrible. I don't know why that was announced during jury selection. And it was a record settlement, which if the jury heard that, that seems like that could have been an influence. We also had statements from Congresswoman Maxine Waters. She made statements at the Dante Wright protest. I think she said, "We're looking for a guilty verdict." And then she said that if Chauvin was not convicted of murder, protesters should stay in the street, get more active, and get more confrontational. We also had President Biden who commented on this. I know it was after the jury was sequestered, but still, they probably could have heard about that somehow. I mean, it's the President of the United States commenting on this trial. I think he said that he was praying for a conviction. He said, "I'm praying the verdict is the right verdict. The evidence is overwhelming in my view." And Judge Cahill himself actually said the statements from Congresswoman Maxine Waters could create an issue for appeal. In this case, the jury was supposed to remain anonymous, but the Star-Tribune, I believe, published quite a bit of information about each one of the jurors that they didn't publish their name or address, but they published enough that I think anyone who knew them probably could figure out who they were. I'm just going to give you one example. So again, this was published in the Star-Tribune. About Juror 27, a black man in his 30s. He immigrated to the United States 14 years ago and went to school in Nebraska and moved to Minnesota in 2012. He works in information technology and lives with his wife and dog. He speaks multiple languages, including French. So that's what was published. I would think anyone who knows him, his friends, probably would know who that was. And private detective or somebody who does enough researching probably could figure out who some of these jurors are. And I think they could probably argue that that was an undue influence on them, knowing that that much information about them was being published. They could also argue on appeal that the prosecution committed misconduct when they referred to Eric Nelson's arguments as stories and nonsense. So that's another thing they could try to argue. They could also try to appeal the third-degree murder conviction on the same grounds that Mohammed Noir is using, which is based on the legal definition of third-degree murder. So what courts could Derek Chauvin try to appeal to? Well, first, he could try to appeal to the Minnesota Court of Appeals. Now, if they refuse to hear his appeal, he could then try to petition the Minnesota Supreme Court to hear his appeal. Now, this is where the Mohammed Noir case is at the Minnesota Supreme Court. If the Minnesota Supreme Court denied his petition or ruled against Chauvin, it is possible that Derek Chauvin could try to appeal to the United States Supreme Court if he could find a federal issue to try to appeal on. I think the likelihood of Derek Chauvin having the United States Supreme Court grant review, I think, is highly unlikely. It's my understanding they really don't grant review in cases like this, hardly ever, but it is possible. I think the likelihood is really low that an appeals court is going to change any of these convictions because the judges are going to be very loath to second guess a jury's decision. We have a verdict from a jury here, and judges are really not going to want to mess with that. That being said, it is still possible that an appeal could succeed. I don't think it's very likely, but in a really highly publicized case like this, we do have an example where an appeal actually worked. And this was just last year, a federal appeals court. They overturned the death sentence of convicted Boston Marathon bomber Dokar Sarnoff while ordering a new penalty trial. And what the appeals court says was they found that the trial judge hadn't properly screened the jurors to ensure that they could ignore the publicity surrounding the case, which could be similar to this case. Again, from everything I've read and seen, I think it's definitely a big uphill battle for Derek Chauvin to successfully appeal this. It seems like the odds are pretty slim, but we'll definitely keep an eye on this, and I'll try to keep you posted. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.